growing number of Jews understandably became desperate to emigrate to Palestine, a situation that reached a peak when the 1936 Nuremberg laws stripped 500,000 German Jews of their citizenship. The increasing number of Jewish immigrants into Palestine led to the White Paper of 1939, a policy document issued by the British government under Neville Chamberlain, which effectively marked the abandonment of British support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine and therefore of the Balfour Declaration itself. A document described by Lord George in Parliament as an act of perfidy. A document over which Winston Churchill voted against the government in which he was a minister. And a document described by the Manchester Guardian as, I quote, a death sentence on tens of thousands of Central European Jews. The large number of Jews entering Palestine, combined with the deep and long-standing animosity of the Arabs, had led to the Arab revolt that began in 1936, with increasingly ferocious attacks on Jewish communities and on the British. At the start of the Arab revolt, a young British intelligence officer, Captain Ord Wingate, arrived in Palestine. To their great surprise, Wingate began making contact with Jewish community leaders, urging them to abandon what he considered a wrong-headed policy of self-restraint and impractical passive defence in the face of repeated murderous assaults by the Arabs. Wingate told David Hakohen, I don't know if that's the correct pronunciation, but I'm sure you'll correct me anyway, a prominent Jew in Haifa, and he said, Wingate said, "I count it my privilege to help you fight your battle. To that purpose, I want to devote my life." He later declared, "When I came to Palestine, I found a whole people who had been looked down upon and made to feel unwanted for scores of generations. Yet at the end of it, they were undefeated and building their country anew. I felt I belonged to such a people." Wingate set about training the Haganah. He then conceived a plan to create a small and mobile unit of elite volunteers known as the Special Night Squads, aimed at taking the offensive to the enemy, denying him the initiative, throwing him off balance. After much resistance, the British commander in Palestine, General Sir Archibald Wavell, agreed to Wingate's plan. The mixed British-Jewish units that Wingate formed unquestionably saved dozens of Jewish settlements from utter destruction. Among Wingate's hand-picked protégés was Moshe Dayan, who later said of him, when he was very senior in the IDF, "Wingate taught us everything we know." Wingate, by now Major General, died 5 years after leaving Palestine while leading the Chindits in Burma in 1944. And I also find this evening that Captain Lewis Harris, who seems to have been in every zone of combat in the war, also fought under Ord Wingate with the Chindits in Burma. David Ben-Gurion wrote that had Wingate lived, he would have been Israel's first military chief of staff. According to Ben-Gurion, it was due to Wingate's training of the Jews in the late 30s that the IDF was established in a matter of just 12 days after the declaration of a Jewish state in 1948. Wingate has often been criticised for his harsh treatment of Arab fighters, but he was careful to treat ordinary Arab citizens with respect and to target only known guerrillas. Among the many attributes that Wingate introduced to what was effectively the embryonic Israeli Defence Forces was this philosophy of respect and discrimination between combatants and non-combatants, the principle of purity of arms. That principle survives in the IDF today and is articulated in an official document an official doctrine taught to all recruits. It can be summed up in the following words: the soldier shall make use of his weaponry and power only for the fulfilment of his mission, and solely to the extent required. He will maintain his humanity even in combat. The soldier shall not employ his weaponry and power in order to harm non-combatants or prisoners of war, and shall do all he can to avoid harming their lives, body, honour or property. Anybody, ladies and gentlemen, who knows and understands the spirit of the IDF knows that these are not mere words on a page, but a reality that is inculcated into all IDF soldiers. It is reflected in the immensely detailed and careful planning that IDF commanders undergo when they prepare for combat operations. But if you listen to much of the Western media, to many politicians, academics, human rights officials and activists, you wouldn't know that. If you read Richard Goldstone's report into the 2009 Gaza conflict for the United Nations Human Rights Council, you would not know that. A report in which Goldstone concluded that Israel had been guilty of, and I quote, violations of international human rights and humanitarian law and possible war crimes and crimes against humanity, in which he found that the IDF had, again I quote, a deliberate policy of disproportionate force aimed not at the enemy but at the civilian population. Having raised hell all around the world by his commission's findings, having inflamed anti-Jewish and anti-Israeli sentiments everywhere, in April of this year, without much reporting, Judge Goldstone, of course, changed his mind. He changed his mind. He said that, and I quote, while the investigations published by the Israeli military and recognised in the UN Committee's report have established the validity of some incidents that we investigated in cases involving individual soldiers, they also indicate that civilians were not intentionally targeted as a matter of policy. Ladies and gentlemen, I could have told him that. In fact, I did tell him that in the evidence that I gave to the UN Human Rights Commission in Geneva in 2009, when I informed them that in the Gaza campaign, the Israeli Defence Forces took greater steps than any other army in the history of warfare to protect the lives of innocent civilians. I wasn't in Gaza, as he was, but I did scrutinise with great care the plans and actions of the IDF in Gaza. I studied media and human rights group reports into what was happening. I talked with journalists and with others who had been in Gaza during the fighting, and I applied my knowledge of the IDF and my 30 years of experience on the ground of this form of military operations in Northern Ireland, the Balkans, Iraq, and in Afghanistan. Something that I'm afraid Judge Goldstone's military advisor does not seem to have done, and consequently was responsible for the military analysis that provided the basis for condemning Israel for war crimes. In October 2009, in an interview with Harper's Magazine, Judge Goldstone's military advisor explained why he didn't believe that Hamas used mosques in Gaza to store munitions. And I quote from his interview, "You will find this hard to believe. If I were a Hamas operative, the last place I'd store munitions would be a mosque. It's not secure, it's very visible, and it would probably be pre-targeted by Israeli surveillance. There are many better places to store munitions." He dismissed as twaddle a subsequent finding by former British Army Colonel Tim Collins, who inspected a mosque in Gaza that had been destroyed because it had been a weapons depot, and there was clear evidence of explosives stored in its cellar. I suspect many other British officers who are fighting in Afghanistan tonight would dispute the assumptions about the likelihood of mosques being used for weapons storage. Judge Goldstone's apparent readiness to believe the untruths of the anti-IDF propaganda campaign that forms a major element of the international conspiracy aimed at delegitimising Israel is increasingly widespread and increasingly virulent, especially in Europe and especially in Great Britain. I can, however, report to you that by and large the opposite is true among our armed forces, where in Afghanistan and Iraq our soldiers have been fighting the same type of enemy, using the same type of tactics as are used by Hamas and by Hezbollah. They know and understand what happens when you fight an enemy that is intent on using its own population as human shields, that deliberately seeks the death of members of their own civilian population as a strategic propaganda tool, in a way that Judge Goldstone patently did not. I'm going to stray slightly off the point for a moment, but I want to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, about Ringo Watson. Ringo Watson is not, as you may immediately think, some kind of retro 60s pop star. But he is a legend in my regiment, the Royal Anglians. Unlike Lord Wingate, his is not a name you will ever have heard of. He was very much more junior than Wingate and lacked his opportunity for impact. But I believe Ringo Watson had something of the Wingate spirit. I say had, because unfortunately he died early this year. Ringo, God only knows what his real name was a corporal in the 1st Battalion of the Royal Anglian Regiment. He was not Jewish and he was not Israeli, but he followed the story of Israel and he admired and respected the IDF, as do most British soldiers. When Egyptian, Syrian, Iraqi and Jordanian armies invaded Israel on Yom Kippur 1973, Ringo was incensed. So much so that he went absent without leave from his battalion and flew out to Israel, taking with him his 7.62mm general purpose machine gun. In those days, it seems you could get away with taking a stripped-down machine gun in your suitcase on an aircraft. But I suspect it may not have been an El Al aircraft. Ringo managed to hook up with an IDF infantry unit and joined the fight. At the end of the war, he returned to Britain and handed himself over to the regimental police, complete with his machine gun, having fired a few bullets through it. Ringo was bussed down to Lance Corporal, but his commanding officer, and indeed the whole battalion, regarded him, and still do regard him, as something of a hero, and he soon regained his rank. For him, life then continued as normal, and Ringo ended his army career about 15 years later as a sergeant major. I mentioned the mutual respect between British and Israeli forces. An experience of mine, I think, illustrates genuine strength and friendship. In 2003, I was sent at about 2 weeks' notice to take command of British forces in Afghanistan. It wasn't anything like the same scale as it is today, either in the size of our forces or in the intensity of combat. But we faced the threat and the reality of suicide bombers, and this was the first time that I had commanded troops under such a threat.